Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be working on an 11 by 14 surface. This is a canvas panel. You see the reference photo. That's on location. I took that picture on location in Robertsville, Missouri, looking at the Merrimack River. Let's go over the colors today. A little bit of the oil that's dripping off of a couple of the blobs of paint, so I'm going to wipe that up with the paper towel first. So we got primary yellow, we got madder lake, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and titanium white. So we're using a very limited palette of colors. These are from the Cobra line. They're made by Royal Talons, and these are water mixable oils. Very cheap brushes today. We're going to see how well you can produce a painting with some brushes that you might buy at a Michael's store. In fact, all of the equipment today is from Michael's, and I'm doing that on purpose to show you that you can get some rather good results even if you don't spend a whole lot of money. So in the canister there, I've got water, and we're starting with one of the larger brushes. These are natural hair brushes that are, I think actually there may be mixed. I think it's a mix of natural hair as well as synthetic. So we're going to start by putting the horizon line in. A lot of artists do this. They'll start with the horizon line. Now, notice something. You don't have to have an exactly perfect line. And I tried a couple times there, as you see. I'm just going to leave that. I'm under the impression as soon as I try to put a perfect line down, I'm in trouble. I don't want to start using a ruler or other things like this. So I'm noticing that tree line, so I'm going to get that in, focusing on the large shapes. And we're going to do the tonal values. We're going to start with a very light wash, basically, mixing this paint with just a little bit of water to make it very thin. And I'm going to get the biggest shapes down. So we got this very large tree shape that comes all the way to the foreground. And then we got the set of trees across the river. This will give us a chance to practice painting water, sky, and foliage. I'm also trying to paint rather quickly. I find that the more time you invest in trying to paint the images, it actually defeats the purpose. I want people to see the brush strokes and think about the boldness of each of these strokes, and I don't want a labored painting. By the way, as we get started today with this painting, if you haven't subscribed already to this channel, I would encourage you to please do so. Give it a thumbs up if you like the content. Most of my videos are long format, so that way you can see every brush stroke as it's taking place on the canvas. Obviously, these are the darkest darks, and so we're getting our darkest darks down with the foliage. I'm not going to paint in with this brown the tonal value of the sky. I'm going to leave that part of the canvas white. It'll make it a little bit easier for the lightest areas, the clouds, to form. Although I might change my mind as we go through this, but we're going to leave that at this point. Now with the water, obviously there are shadows. We can see the reflections, rather, in the water from the trees. And so those strokes, I'm just pulling the paint directly down. And my interpretation of the water today is that it is slightly less dark than the trees on the shoreline. As I may have covered in previous videos, the water is a variable in terms of the tonal value. Your verticals are always going to be the darkest. So your trees, your foliage, buildings, etc. are usually the dark on the canvas. Then it'll be the ground plane, and finally the sky. But with water, it's a little different. Water can be darker than your darkest dark sometimes. It can be very light. So there is a little bit of a variety in terms of water. Now I am going to put, as you see me, this is just burnt umber for the whole thing right now. And now I'm mixing in titanium white to change the tonal value. And if you squint, you can see the tonal value shifts. This is going to be a fairly realistic painting today. And so the shifts of the tonal values that I'm using for the burnt umber are not too great. It's not a big difference here. But I'm getting in basically my sketch of what that scene looks like. And notice, it's not very detailed at all right now. They just looks like blobs, but it does give us a starting point. Notice with these brushes, you want to hold it at least to the middle or near the end of the handle. That allows your gestures to be a little bit less precise, which is actually what you want in a painting. And notice, now at this point, I'm pretty much done with the big shapes. Now, I'm noticing the riverbank is lighter than these colors I put down. So I'm using the same lighter color, which is fairly similar to the watercolor, and pulling that now along the horizon line. Now keep in mind, we're obviously going to be painting over all of this. We will allow a little bit of the brown to show through, and sometimes that can be really advantageous. The little table easel with some coupons, I think it would set you back. I talked about the fact that this video, we're using very cheap supplies to see what can we do with really cheap setup. If you're interested in starting out, you're just beginning, don't want to spend a lot of money. The tabletop easel here was like $25 from Michael's. I had coupons though, so I basically got it for like $7. Oh wait, actually I bought this palette I'm using as well from Michael's. Just a wood palette, a very common palette that they carry. And so with all of my coupon rewards or what have you, I got the easel, which I think lists for $25, and the palette I think is like $8. I think I got it both for like $7.50. And then these brushes, like I said, I believe were in a package of brushes there for like about $8 as well. Bought them at a different time. The biggest problem with these cheap brushes, a lot of the hairs are falling out already. And this is the first time I've used them. Of course, that would even happen sometimes with better brushes, but you really do notice that with these cheaper brushes. And then the ferrules, the metal ferrules that connect to the wood brush, sometimes are a little loose. Now, the best thing to do is if you can still get a pretty accurate stroke with it, just wait, and then if it does loosen up too much, you can insert some super glue in the ferrule to hold that the metal part on the wood stick. What happens is I believe they use a very cheap glue in that manufacturing process, and so mineral spirits or even water dilutes that glue that holds the brush together. Okay, so now you see that I've got a mixture. I'm just mixing right into that same pool of color, ultramarine blue, some titanium white. In addition, I'm also allowing some of that burnt umber to be in there. And now we're going to quickly fill in the majority of the sky. And here again, I'm going to start with the darkest dark of the sky, which is this darker blue. And I'm going to leave space for some of the clouds. I'm also going to put this down rather thinly. When you are using titanium white in large amounts, one thing that you will quickly begin to understand is that titanium white is one of the slowest drying colors on the palette. Now, especially if this limited palette, it certainly is the slowest to dry. The quickest to dry on this particular palette would be the burnt umber, because that's an earth tone color. The next color that's the longest to dry would be the primary yellow. And then the madder lake. And the second quickest to dry is the ultramarine blue. Sorry, my hand's kind of in the way, but I do think you can see most of the color shifts. So now I'm adding some burnt umber into that blue mixture to create a brownish gray. And this creates instant color harmony, because in almost all of my mixtures, I'm going to have a little bit of each of these colors that are on the palette. I'm really not trying to exactly match the reference photo that you see. At this stage, I'm always thinking, I want to create a wonderful painting. I'm not as interested in creating an exact replica of the reference. However, today, what I've found is that the painting looks fairly realistic at the conclusion. Which is somewhat surprising when you think that, like I said, I'm not trying to convey that with a minute brush or, but rather with a lot of chunky laying down of the paint in bigger masses, and then using this process of making sure the tonal values are correct by squinting and getting the brown on there first, and then being able to compare it to the other colors around it. Now I'm mixing in more of the titanium white, obviously. The clouds and sky closest to the larger tree in the foreground appear cloudier and lighter in color. And so that's why I'm putting it down like this. By the way, just revamped my entire website. So now my new website, you can find my paintings available for sale, davidpoe.org. DAVIDPOE.org. So if you happen to be a collector that's looking at the painting process to see how I do it, one thing that might set me apart from many artists out there is that from time to time, you will actually see me painting a painting that you can purchase, which I think would be kind of interesting, don't you? This way, not only do you have, if you purchase this painting, have it in your living room or office space, wherever you might display this work of art. And not only is the work of art itself a conversation starter, but you will be able to go back to this YouTube video and say, well, we even have a copy of the artist painting this particular painter, this particular painting that we can see come to life. So it's certainly performance art. Now notice in this first stage of getting the sky in, the different hues, the different colors in the sky look a little bit flat, and the lines are a little bit, they're not very soft. They're pretty sharp right now. But that's okay, because I will be coming back to soften those later on. This is just the first pass for these clouds. Notice I vary the brush strokes quite a lot, and I want it to be soft. When we think of clouds, when we think of the sky and the air, we think of it as being a rather soft environment. And so I want to try to convey that to the viewer in the paint, both in the colors of the paint as well as the application of the paint. So while these colors are being put on a little bit thicker than the underpainting of the burnt umber that we did to establish the tonal values we're going to be using today, this is still fairly light application of paint. And even though I'm looking over at that photo reference constantly, I'm trying to lay down the paint as quickly as I possibly can, which keeps my brain from thinking about being too precise. One of the things we want to avoid is making the same type of mark over and over again. That type of repetition can easily destroy a painting. It creates patterns that we sometimes are not aware of. until we're in the gallery staring at it on the wall and noticing, oh boy, those particular brush strokes look all the same. Some have asked what type of equipment I use for the videos. I produce the videos by first filming them on just a very common iPhone. It's an iPhone SE 3. So it's not even a very advanced camera. And then I transfer the finished raw video onto my iPad Pro 11, I think it's generation 5 or 4. And then I use LumaFusion is the name of the app. I put it into LumaFusion. I separate the audio from the video because I'm not talking during the actual painting. And then I can delete all of the audio and then go back and do a voiceover. And essentially, that's all I do. I've decided that for these videos, most of my viewers appreciate being able to see every brushstroke rather than cutting a lot of that out or speeding up certain sections. So, the editing's pretty straightforward. I'm just putting the video up there, maybe making a couple of cuts if I leave the room or something, and then I do the voiceover. Now here, as we get into this water section, I'm making sure that the strokes are either up or down, not across. This will give us help with the illusion of water. And then I'm basically making a mixture here of ultramarine blue, titanium white, and a little bit of the burnt umber. In addition, it's mixing a little bit with the burnt umber titanium white that I already put down for the tonal value. Now, if you squint, you will see that the water color basically disappears next to that tonal value. So that means that we've got the right color. Because when we squint and we can't distinguish between those two areas, that's what we actually want. And I'm just adding different paints now to that same pool. A little bit more ultramarine blue, a little bit more titanium white to suggest that this part sits back a little bit farther. So it's going to be a little bit lighter in color. And then if you see, there's some other spots that are also a little bit lighter in the foreground. And so now I'm just, once again, just pulling the colors down towards me with the brush. Now, if the lines are too prominent, in other words, where one color begins and the other ends, I'll be going back over some of that to soften that value switch. There's this wonderful opening in the trees back there that's allowing some of the light to come straight down. And so that's what I'm kind of indicating right now. See, again, just making sure that I'm pulling the color downward. notice at this point, because we don't have the canvas totally covered with color, it's hard to necessarily distinguish whether those colors are going to be as accurate as we think they are. It's only and so we have to suspend judgment for a while and allow ourselves to mix the colors, get the basic color down on the palette, and then onto the canvas. And then we can do more comparisons, and that will help us to further shape the painting. Just cleaning off the brushes at this point. The blue is on there well enough that now we're going to move into the greens. Of course, the lightest lights I'm going to wait. Those are actually highlights. And so here I was just pointing out that I'll be working on the foliage. 2 colors, the only ones on the palette that are going to make green. Primary yellow and the ultramarine blue. And then also to darken that up a little bit, to make it a little bit more natural, we're going to add a little bit of that red, which is the Madder Lake. And hopefully you can begin to see that by limiting your color choices, it makes things so much easier. You're not having to worry about trying to get color harmony with 20 different colors. And nor are you tempted to try to use a color right out of the tube. Because every color we're using today, I'm mixing. I'm taking from the primaries and then mixing them together to get it. Now the darkest dark here is in this foreground tree. That's a little hard to see there. It may just look like a big dark blob. But the good thing is that I actually took this picture, and I did a different painting on it from that same location. So I remember the site. I have another painting somewhere of this river. So I remember some of the nuances better than the painting. Better than the photo, rather. And so I'm making sure that I trust myself to recall my impression of it. And notice it's so dark, in fact, that as I look on the video right now, it almost looks blue rather than green. Here, those darker areas appear throughout the tree, primarily because it's closer to us than any of the other trees. So we want to make sure that it stands out a little bit darker, a little bit more detail, because it is the closest thing that we have in this painting towards the viewer. Now here's the water shadow and reflection. So once again, all the brush strokes are moving downward, at least in those strokes. We don't want a lot of crisscross or anything like that. Not in water. once in a while grabbing some water like I would an oil medium. Of course, you got to be careful. You don't want to use too much water when you do that. You don't want to dilute the pigment to the point where as the water evaporates from the painting, you may end up having some of the canvas not covered by paint pigment if you mix in too much water. Right into that pile again. We're going to mix a different green. The tonal value is just slightly different than the large vertical tree that we just spent some time on with the darkest darks. And here I'm doing a little comparisons to what I'm seeing on the reference photo, and certainly noting that it's just not dark enough yet. Here I like this color much better. And so now, this is sort of a middle value color. If you squint, it disappears with the brown, which is what we want. And mainly this darker color is in the middle of these this forested type area. So there are going to be some lighter trees and shrubs in front, and then an opportunity to not use quite as much paint at the very tops of the trees so that we can have the illusion that some of the sky is peeking through the branches and the leaves of the trees. Here I'm just trying to vary my brush strokes, also allowing a little bit of the underpainting to show through. Your eye needs a little bit of relief with all that green, and how it gets that is it craves red from the other side of the color wheel. And of course this burnt umber is a sort of brownish red. And that gives our eyes what they crave, to leave some of that suggested and underneath it. Here, I've varied the color just a little bit. This is a little bit yellower. Added some of the primary yellow in. And notice how subtle these shifts are now. that whole big area is certainly still one mass, and it's not really different colors necessarily, but it's the same tonal value, just different highlights. And once again, we've got the shadow reflection going into the water. So that's the main area of the brown that's still left. And here I'm judging it a little bit lighter than the trees themselves, and so I'm figuring out that color. Once again, with water, you're just pulling that color straight down. Just getting my brush with enough color to pull it off. Of course, using the limited palette also saves money. The water mixable oils are not as expensive as many oils, traditional oils are. And then because I'm limiting it to only 5 colors, I don't have to have tons and tons of room, and I don't have to have tons and tons of paint. And when you get used to the limited palette, you'll begin to discover those situations where you might need something else, but it's actually few and far between. Sometimes the best tool you have is your finger. I'm using my finger just to blot the edges of where the the different shades meet. It produces a softener. You could use a fan brush, I suppose, but this also works quite well. Once in a while, it's good to get up, stretch, take a look at the painting from a different view, farther away. Sometimes if you're sitting too close, especially with a tabletop easel, you begin to try to put in too many details. And when you get back away from your painting, you realize that the eye is already filling in the details for you. You don't have to put them in. Here I'm just contemplating what I'm going to do next and taking a moment to wash off my brushes. Here I'm just fixing up this one area where that light is coming through the trees. You can see that clearly on the reference photo and in the water. And now I'm cleaning up the tops of the trees, covering up the browns, allowing some of the sky color to kind of mix in a little bit more to suggest where the branches are a little bit lighter, there's fewer leaves, and so you see more of the sky. If you have comments, suggestions, subjects that you would like me to cover, by all means, you're welcome to make comments. I usually respond to all comments within 24 hours. Now it's really starting to take shape. Do you see what I'm saying? Is that when you step away from it a little bit, that it looks very realistic, I think. And you sort of get lost, and if you stop thinking about trying to paint trees and rivers, but just concentrate on the shapes and tonal values, limiting your color choices and your color mixtures, you can produce some wonderful work. And oils, even these water mixable oils, are very forgiving. If you don't like something, you can always go back over it. The only thing you have to remember is that you've got to put a little bit more paint over top of the paint levers that you put down earlier. So as you can tell now, these mixtures are a lot thicker than they were before. Here's ultramarine blue and my primary yellow. Once again, a little bit of titanium white. And look how many different greens we're getting from just those colors. And of course, you add a little bit red, you get a little bit darker red, a little bit earthier green rather. So, and of course, in those distant tree levels, you notice that I didn't, with each of the greens there, I didn't put a whole lot of red in. That's because as you move further back, red is the first color to dissipate. Whereas in this foreground tree, I added more of the Madder Lake into the mixture with the ultramarine blue and the primary yellow. Now here is obviously a lighter version of green, just to give the subtle suggestion that while if you squint, you can't see any difference between the two colors. But when you open your eyes fully, you sense that there are places that are just a little bit darker, indicating the depth of the tree that's inside there. And on the reference photo, I can't really see a bunch of limbs or anything like that today. So I'm not even going to put those in, partly because that would draw our focus right to those branches, because they would be details, right? Whereas in today's photo, really the focus I want to draw you in is the opening between the trees and how that reflected light falls on the river. So it's actually, the focal point's actually on the other side of the shore. And we'll make that more abundantly clear with some of the clouds and with some of the details that are about to come. Here, you see once again, I've already got basically my roadmap for the painting because of those tonal values that we put in earlier. Varying my brush strokes, and of course very, very gentle brush strokes around the edges where the tree is meeting the sky. I want to give the appearance, I want to make sure there's enough paint on my brush in order for it to stick on top of it. But I also don't mind it mixing just slightly with the blue sky. And then it kind of creates its own little sky holes. And then I'm just trying to mimic a little bit what I sort of see in that tree. It doesn't have to be a perfect likeness. I'm not trying to, okay, this branch is this thickness, and so I'm going to make it like that. I'm allowing myself to have a little bit of freedom with those shapes. And now, with that lighter green shade, I want to make sure that I put a few spots in the water reflections indicating that. For one thing, you always want to have some variety in color. It usually doesn't look too good to have just one particular color dominate in one shape area, because it lends itself to looking rather flat. Looking at the time at this point, you'll notice something, that even this method, we're not spending all day creating a painting that looks very realistic, are we? We're almost to the hour mark, and the painting's almost done. There's a few highlights to come still, but the vast majority of the work has already been accomplished. And partly the reason for that was I pushed myself to not think too much, just get that paint down, react to the scene. This should help you if you do a lot of plein air painting outdoors, because outdoors you only have the particular light effect for a small window of time. Most paintings outdoors really have to be completed within 2 hours. Otherwise, the light changes so substantially that you either have to remember what the light was doing when you came up with the idea in the first place, or you end up chasing the light, they say, because the light is constantly changing. And if you're chasing it, then that means you're going to be in a position in which you're trying to lighten areas all the time to fit what you currently see, which is not a good thing to do, right? If you got highlights everywhere, then you have no highlights. Here, I'm getting a light green, and I'm going to put for the highlights across the river. And this will make it pop and should immediately show you that over there is where the the focus of attention is going to be. And once again, I'm just kind of trying to suggest floral shapes. The sun's hitting the tops of these smaller trees and shrubs just enough to get rid of that sense that, oh, that's just a big green blob back there. Well, now notice something. It's with just these few little brush strokes. I'm not putting a lot of pressure. I am using a lot of paint though. And I'm looking at the reference and attempting to follow the direction of these shapes and colors. And notice how your mind, your brain is already trying to make this into a scene that you know. So I'm not really drawing trees or shrubs by the shoreline here. I'm just touching little pieces of paint to the canvas to highlight the tonal value here. Now, if you squint, you'll notice that this lighter green actually just blends right into that larger shape. And that's also intentional. It's just a very subtle difference in the color, but not really the tonal value. If there was, then when you squint, then you would recognize that there's really a different tonal value going on. But in this case, when you squint, you see the tonal value difference in the sky in comparison to these larger shapes, or the water in terms of the larger shapes that we are putting up on the land there. Now I'm going to use some of this lighter green. I'm going to mix in just a little bit darker and add just a few little trace highlights on the big foreground tree as well. Before I get there, I'm going to put the reflections down. So pulling the paint in just one direction again to suggest that it is water rather than foliage. That would look pretty strange if we had foliage in the water space, right? So how we flatten that out is by just pulling the strokes completely down. And so this area there that had the original little bit of a tonal shift in it is the area of my sketch, and now I'm putting that green on top of it. And look how that also is pulling our attention across the river and to that shoreline where there's a break in the trees. So everything at this point in terms of highlights is very precise. I want to make sure that I'm telling the viewer enough so the viewer is not wandering around aimlessly thinking, where am I supposed to look? I've broken a couple of the rules here. I often do this, is that the focal point's almost dead center. But I feel like I've been able to pull it off, because often when I do this, it's so subtle, and I suggest some things around the edges with the color harmony of the limited palette that continues to draw you in a more of an O composition or a circle composition that you're constantly being pulled in by the different bluish tones and grayish tones in the water to the center where that light is flickering off the water surface. And then you're just kind of staying in that area and then being guided by the trees that surround the painting. Obviously, this large tree on the side of the painting here, it acts as a natural barrier, keeping you from going off the page, but rather intriguing you to look at some of the other areas of interest, like the river and where it disappears behind that large tree, the shoreline and some of those reddish browns that we see on the shoreline really draws our attention because of so much green around it. The cones in their eyes desire that red, like I mentioned. Time to clean the brushes again. A few more highlights. People are asking, how do I price my paintings? I do it by size. By the square inch is what a lot of artists do, and that way it makes it rather fair. Some artists are moved to put a price on it based on not just the size, but if they feel that it is a little bit better than their average work, they may increase this price a little bit. Some artists also increase when they go to plein air festivals and so forth. They may increase it a little bit because of the expectation that they've traveled, they're part of this event. And usually a larger proportion of the sale is going towards the hosting group or the organization that's raising money through the plein air event. Now, as far as what the rate is per square inch, if you're first starting out, you might want to keep it pretty low. You may want to start out with 50 cents per square inch or $1 per square inch. And then as you get better, increase by small increments. That way, you'll continue to sell even as you are growing in your artistic talent. You're also keeping your buyers from getting upset with you. No one wants to collect someone's paintings and then find out, wait a second, I paid $200 and you're selling this one for $50, or I bought this for $400 and now I see that I could have gotten a comparable value somewhere else, maybe not on the gallery, but directly from the artist. So you need to make sure that your prices are consistent across galleries and across your own internet site. You can certainly make allowances for what you might call studies if you just really don't think that they're as good as some of the other paintings that you've done. That would be one way you could sell them, is just call them studies. Maybe not give them names. Do something that's a little different to indicate that the reason this is cheaper is that it's not quite up to the par of what you would put in a gallery. There's a lot of thought on showing your work. Some artists will say, only show your best stuff. But that begs the question, how do you know what your best stuff is? When you're first starting out, you might be discouraged to try to sell any of it. And so I would suggest that you learn by going ahead and trying to sell everything. Pick the same price though, and then what's going to happen is your viewers are going to help you determine which paintings really are your best. And as time passes, you'll become much more able to discern that for yourself. And then it will be rather natural to say, yes, I need to not put this one in the gallery, or this one is certainly capable of winning an award, so I will enter it in a contest. But first, you just have to win the battle by painting more often. And that really is something that you need to pay attention to. The first move in painting is to pick up the brush and the canvas, the surface you're going to paint on. The vast majority of people never do that. They may watch some videos, they may admire painters, and they may purchase paintings, but many artists, what sets them apart is they were the ones that at least purchased some simple supplies like I did today, not spending a whole lot of money, but picking up the brush and starting to put the colors down. It's half the battle, it really is. Now, obviously, you may look at that photo reference and say, well, it's not an exact match. Well, I don't need it to be an exact match, but if you look at it, there's certainly some similarities. And I would maintain that, or at least one quality I'm trying to practice here, is that I want the painting to look almost more real than the photo reference. By that I mean that the painting conveys more of the feeling of actually being there and looking into the darkest darks with certain shadows and colors and just small bits of detail. The same way with every other section of the painting. Now, obviously, the people that see your painting aren't going to see the reference photo. They're not going to know exactly what you're painting. And so, what they care most about is, does the painting adequately represent that place to the best of my memory? As we're coming to the end of this instructional video today, reminder, if you've enjoyed the content, there are other videos that you can check out. And be sure to subscribe if you haven't subscribed to the channel. That way, whenever I release another video, you'll be able to see it first. Now here, I'm doing something that artists often refer to as reestablishing the darks. I want to make sure that some of those other lights pop out more. One way to do that would be, you might think, well, you just go lighter. Well, when you're using a limited palette, sometimes that's the wrong thing to do. What you really need to do is just go back in with some darker darks next to your highlights. And then that will have the same effect. It will kick up the reflections, the sense of light. And it will actually do it much more convincingly than if you had tried to do it the other way by producing kind of garish greens in order to get lighter and lighter. A couple more details to do. I'm going to be putting some lighter lights in the sky with a mixture, you'll see me mix this in a few minutes, of titanium white and just a touch of the primary yellow. Give it the sense that the sun is hitting those clouds. I'm also going to do a lighter brownish color with a mixture of the burnt umber and a lot of titanium white. Now I need to get away from it, step back, see what I think of it. Before rushing to apply it. A lot of paintings are destroyed in the last part of the painting process because we get too eager to put too many details in. Too quickly. Here I'm dipping into that titanium white, and this is the clouds that I told you about. Then a little bit of that primary yellow, create a kind of off-white, creamy yellow shade to highlight these. And one of the things you're going to notice here is that where I'm putting these is in the middle of the painting again. Why? Because that's where the focal point is, the light coming down on that water between those trees. And so I want to get your attention in that area as much as possible. And another trick of doing that is by putting these highlights in that area, directing our attention to where we want the viewer's eyes to go, and to be a little bit judicious in terms of where else I put this same color. I don't want it everywhere, but I do want it in certain places where I want to catch your eye. And then in a few minutes, you're going to see me actually finger paint again. I'm going to soften up some of these sky holes and edges to these clouds with just pressing one of my fingers into the paint. If you don't like to do that with your flesh, you could always wear a glove and do the same thing. However, I do find that the glove takes off too much paint when you do that, and you don't get the same kind of feeling, sense of tactile touch to kind of give you more information when you've got your fingertips covered. Does that make sense? See how that yellowish titanium white really pulls our eye to the center of the piece now. Now here are some sky holes. Now at first, I'm just taking that same color and just, trying to vary my strokes a little bit at a few of the places where I see the sky kind of breaking through. And then once again, I'm going to remove some of that paint in a very eccentric way, if you will, just by putting my finger on it. And that takes just enough of the paint away for it to read as being very realistic rather than labored. If you would be interested in buying this painting or other paintings, like I mentioned earlier, I have a new revamped website. It's David Poe, DAVIDPOE.org. O-R-G. There's some more information on the website about who I am, the materials I've been using, and then, of course, my works. Right now, it's a little bit sparse, but I'm going to be adding more things as certainly as time goes along. Now I'm going to sign my name. This is just a little rubber device, and I'm going to pick that dark spot over there. It'll show up a little bit better, be a little easier to write my name on the side. Once in a while, you'll notice that with thin paint, it's already kind of dried onto the canvas, so I actually kind of have to carve it in there today. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Let's get a quick close-up if you want. A little too close. There we go. See how up close you don't really see all the details, right? From a distance, it looks detailed enough. Up close, it just looks like little flicks and pieces of color.